Hello, Matt.
Hey, how are you?
Hello, Marion. And hi,
Hey,
Karen.
how are you?
Doing
It's
all
good.
right. You?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's
It's
been a
good to
long
see
day so far, but we're still kicking.
you.
How are you, Matt?
I'm good. I mean, I'm 2020 good. You know what I mean?
Well, I do know what you mean.
Um, let's wait a few minutes, see who joins us.
Mm.
So have you already started recording?
I don't know the answer to that question. Only Karen knows.
My screen says recording.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, I
Oh,
see.
that's right. I see it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Give it maybe just another minute or so, Marion.
Sure.
Yeah, the people are still filing in, so let's just hang on a minute.
Yeah.
That's a funny image when you say people
Filing.
filing in. Filing into the cyber room,
Exactly.
taking their cyber chairs. Well, we're trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy.
We do what we can.
So this, were you able to use that slide that I sent to one of the 2013 demonstration that showed the NALC members? Because I referenced it right at the beginning.
Oh, I have not seen it myself, but I wasn't on the call yet,
It
so
was on the flyer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Just didn't want to look like an idiot for referencing it, and then everybody's like, "Wait,
What are you talking about?
what slide? What album cover?"
Okay, I think it's 7:03. Do you want to call us to order, Marion?
I'd be delighted to call you to order. Welcome, Dr. Rubio. I too am an ex-postal worker. I was a clerk. First, I was a distribution clerk, and I read that you were as well. I did it 6 years on the overnight shift, and then I got a day job at a branch, and I became a sales associate. And I was there for 25 years, and I enjoyed it greatly. I did start going to library school, taking classes part-time, and then the post office again offered a buyout, and I took it, and now I work for the New Haven Free Public Library. It's an honor to bring you here tonight. I'm really looking forward to your talk. I read parts of your book, and of course I read your intro, and I saw a clip on, I wanna say Colbert. Yeah.
Yeah, that was in 2011, the Colbert Report.
He didn't let you talk much, but we'll give you the chance to talk tonight. So again, welcome on behalf of the New Haven Free Public Library. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Karen. We appreciate the collaboration, and we're looking to hear from you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marion. I'm Matthew Jacobson. I'm the acting co-director of the Public Humanities program at Yale. Welcome, everybody. I can't say it's great to see you because I don't see you, but it's good to share this space with you, and we're just eager for the moment when we can all be together in the same room again. I'm so thankful to Marion Huggins, Luis Chavez Romel, and Seth Godfrey, our main collaborators in the New Haven Free Public Library. I also want to thank my colleague Karen Rothman, who's working very hard behind the scenes even now. and our assistant, Amy DePoy, who has done a lot for this event and is working behind the scenes. One program note, our next event is Tuesday, November 17th, again at 7 o'clock. Our colleague in the psychology department at Yale, Jennifer Richardson, will be speaking. The title of her talk is Diversity and Democracy, ? Psychological and Political Backlash to Our Increasingly Diverse Nation. And I can only say it'll be interesting to see what world we're living in on November 17th. For now, remaining ever hopeful, I'm really delighted to welcome Philip Rubio. Professor Rubio earned his PhD in history from Duke University, and he's currently on faculty at North Carolina A&T State University, where he teaches US history, African American history, and world history. He's the author of 2 award-winning books, There's Always Work at the Post Office, African American Postal Workers and the Fight for Jobs, Justice, and Equality, and A History of Affirmative Action. And just this year, he published his 3rd book, Undelivered, From the Great Postal Strike of 1970 to the Manufacturing Crisis of the US Postal Service. As Marianne mentioned, in what is an interesting first for our Democracy in America series, I can also say that you might have seen our guest several years ago on the Colbert Report. The run of show here is quite simple. Phil will talk for 20 or 30 minutes. He and I will chat for another few, and then we will field your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your toolbar on the webinar. So without further ado, I am delighted to welcome Phil Rubio.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Marion and Karen, for inviting me to speak at your Democracy in America series. So it's both opportune and unfortunate that this could not be a more timely and relevant topic, as the survival of both the post office and democracy itself in America hang in the balance. The image that everybody saw when they first came in, you may have also seen on the flyer for this event, is a photograph that I borrowed from the National Association of Letter Carriers. It shows NALC Branch 36, Manhattan, Bronx, members leading a protest along with members of other postal unions and postal supporters against postal consumers, against Postal Service plans to cut Saturday delivery as part of the futile attempt to cut costs to manage a politically imposed debt by Congress in 2006. So this was on March 24th, 2013. It was 43 years after the 1970 nationwide postal wildcat strike. And they filled the streets of 8th Avenue between 31st and 33rd Streets in front of the James A. Farley Post Office. In 1970, back then it was known as the General Post Office. And it was the second post office to walk out, the first being the Grand Central Station, since then renamed the Vincent R. Sombrado Post Office after a key strike leader for Branch 36. More diverse than the original 1970 walkout that already had large numbers of African Americans, but few women because of their small numbers in the post office, the 2013 gathering continued the grassroots democratic tradition embodied in that 1970 strike. So with over 209,000 postal employees involved, the 1970 strike was the largest wildcat strike in US labor history. It defied both the federal government and its own unions in what became a successful attempt at winning a living wage and more job rights at a reformed post office. So the hybrid government/business US Postal Service created by Congress with the 1970 Postal Reorganization Act after the strike was a big step in that direction. But the Postal Reorganization Act came with a huge built-in flaw of mandating the Postal Service eventually become self-supporting while maintaining universal low-cost service under congressional oversight. This unintentionally set it up for the manufactured crisis it has endured since the Great Recession of 2008. So what I want to talk about today is both the idea and the practice over time of the post office. As venerable as this institution is with a 245-year-old history, the post office has been both an enabler of democracy as well as a vehicle to suppress democracy. And we're also talking about the idea and practice of American democracy. Like American democracy, the post office has been simultaneously and contradictorily a visionary institution, a political force and a contested site. To maintain a healthy democracy, I argue that we need a healthy post office and vice versa. I also argue that postal possibilities can and should be realigned with its brighter past to service in the future. So what I think best expresses the idea of the post office is not found in its founding documents, but ironically in the Postal Reorganization Act that mandated actual universal equitable service performed by well-compensated and represented workers. And nothing compels discussion and debate over democracy and the post office better than existential threats to both, which is what we face today. So we're meeting tonight, a week before the election, when President Donald Trump has already pre-contested its outcome. Should he lose, falsely claiming that mail-in ballots are fraudulent and would be to blame if he lost. And by confusing to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, he has threatened a constitutional crisis. Meanwhile, the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy's mail delay policies have led to, so far, 7 recent federal district court injunctions, one settlement, and many harsh words from 5 judges regarding what they termed the appearance of deliberate ballot suppression. So what is Trump and DeJoy's idea of the post office? Is it mail as a commodity? Is it the Postal Service as a political tool? Or the Postal Service as a hub of FedEx and UPS? And is this what we asked for? So the current crisis of the Postal Service during the COVID-19 pandemic has created a daily tutorial on something that many, if not most Americans, take for granted, namely their own post office. Many, I'm sure, were unaware of the 1970 to 71 transition from the Post Office Department to the U.S. Postal Service, or the fact that the Postal Service has been fully self-supporting since 1983, or the great damage done by the 2006 Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. For 2 reasons, actually, both from the massive imposed debt through the Retiree Health Benefits Fund of $5.6 billion set aside each year for 10 years. And this was in a year where the Postal Service had nearly $1 billion in surplus, 2006, but also in the limits placed on postal competitiveness, postal rates and competitiveness. So this is the exact opposite of the 1840s and 1850s protective legislation. The PAEA created a manufactured crisis starting in 2009 with the Great Recession. Revenue losses from the Great Recession and the internet could not pay for this annual retiree health benefits fund. It was unnecessary except to help the George W. Bush administration keep the federal budget balanced. This was after a $71 billion overpayment into the civil service retirement system. The CSRS was discovered in 2002. So for the last 2 decades, advocates of postal privatization have dominated the public square with their arguments that the Postal Service was a digital dinosaur carrying useless junk mail by overpaid union employees. And this imposed debt became a fait accompli. It was something that seemed to prove their argument. Many of us have argued against that kind of gaslighting since that time, but since March 2020, with the pandemic and the United States Postal Service pleading for operational cash due to COVID-19, but denied those funds by Trump and the Senate, except for a $10 billion loan with lots of strings. Most media outlets that I've seen have finally brought the voices of both scholars and everyday people to illustrate the fact that everyday people move the mail. Everyday people depend on the mail. And everyday people object to the deliberate partisan curtailment of the mail. In fact, we can see, and I'm gratified to see that interviews with postal workers, not just union presidents, suddenly matter, along with the voices of postal customers. Issues of the role of the post office in creating Black wealth, careers, and social status over time have suddenly also found widespread discussion. This became especially important after the Black Lives Matter national protests and discussions since George Floyd's murder by Minneapolis police on May 25th, 2020. Those of us who study the post office always try to be objective in assessing its faults as well as its benefits. Although as advocates, it makes it hard in public to frame the Postal Service as public service victim number one when postal policies often manage to defy sympathy. And that was even before Postmaster General DeJoy. But pointing out the post office's historical flaws up to the present reminds us of the gap between its democratic promise and how fraught its history has always been. So the same could be said of American democracy, which grew up in a slaveholding republic committed to removing Native Americans, enlarging suffrage to include propertyless white men, while disfranchising blacks, women, and the poor. And it has managed to remain contentious to this day. So Richard John has written the definitive work of the early post office. And in his book, as well as recent newspaper articles in support of the post office, he observes how it took more than an independence war to break with the European model of using the post as a revenue builder for the national treasury. Now, John highlights how the 1792 Post Office Act provided for newspaper subsidies in the mail, both to generate political discussion and debate, as well as elevate the publishing business. John finds both Federalists and Democratic Republicans, from Jonathan Turnbull Jr. to James Madison, appreciating the circulation of newspapers through the post as imperative to democracy. In fact, George Washington even thought newspapers should be mailed for free. Meanwhile, Ray Brescia and Richard Brody have reminded us that the revolutionary period in American history reveals the beginnings of that break with the European model. Brescia writes that in, quote, July 1775, rebel leaders needed a way to communicate. Concerned that loyalist postal clerks would pry into their correspondence, they created what they would call the Constitutional Post, stretching from what is now Maine to Georgia, led by the first Postmaster General, Benjamin Franklin, unquote. And we have Richard John, David Henkin, Winifred Gallagher, and others. They've discussed how the post office promoted American development, which we conflate with democracy, but we all know was not always necessarily so. So the post office is a government service that arguably created America, as Winifred Gallagher put it. In the words of Daniel Carpenter, quote, American democracy is umbilically joined to our country's postal service, unquote. And he has some paradoxical examples. For, on the one hand, that same 1792 Post Office Act that kicks things off, he also talks about this being a white man's project, quote unquote, designed to spur white settlement westward. He also makes note of the early 19th century petitions and racist newspapers using the mail in Georgia to promote the deportation of Native Americans. On the other hand, he points out, quote, mailed newspapers carried party ballots to voters, and mail-in voting was widespread during the 19th century, and especially during the Civil War. Electoral democracy depended on the Postal Service's vast platform. And we have Richard Kilbowitz showing us how technology in the 19th century and 20th centuries marked both opportunities and threats to the future of the post office, but the post office is still standing and managed to absorb those technologies. For instance, while some were predicting that the telegraph would eliminate the need for mail, its inventor, Samuel Morse, in the 1830s and 40s, thought it rightfully belonged as part of the postal network. But Congress only let the post office keep it from 1844 to 1846 before selling it to private industry in 1847. There were many who said the same of the telephone industry, that it would replace the post office in the early 20th century, yet AT&T's monopolistic practices almost provoked President Woodrow Wilson to nationalize it as part of postal telecommunications. And before World War I ended, he did in fact nationalize both telephone and telegraph for just over a year, placing both of them under the control of the Postmaster General. Meanwhile, what was Wilson's idea of the post office? As we shall see, it was one that no longer provided openings for Black labor, which had grown to 10% of the postal workforce in less than 50 years. But even before African Americans could work at the post office, starting in 1865, they formed a crucial element in the movement for abolition in the first half of the 19th century that fought for the use of the mail to wage that campaign. The African-American idea of the post office would clash with the dominant white postal paradigm. It would later challenge Jim Crow postal union locals, postal hiring and promotion discrimination, and it would play a major role in the 1970 Postal Strike and subsequent postal union reform, thus proving correct Postmaster General Gideon Granger's 1802 conspiracy theory of Black postal labor, which I will explain in a minute. So the early republic enslaved 1/5 of the United States population. Postmaster General Gideon Granger, a wealthy Connecticut Yankee with a Yale degree, convinced Congress to pass the first in a series of laws in 1802, reserving postal jobs for, quote, free white persons only, unquote. No one had to guess his motives. He made them clear, at least in a confidential letter to the chair of the Senate Post Office Committee. Granger served as Postmaster General longer than anyone else to date, from 1801 to 1814. And he wrote this letter March 23rd, 1802, to the chair of the Senate Post Office Committee, James Jackson, a Democratic Republican from Georgia and a fellow slaveholder. Granger pointed out the dangers of allowing Blacks to work for the post office. Granger and others were especially fearful of the successful rebellion of enslaved Africans in the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, which became the Free Black Republic of Haiti in 1804. Granger argued, quote, an objection exists against employing Negroes or people of color in transporting the public mails. He pointed out that, quote, we cannot be too cautious in attempting to prevent similar evils in the 4 southern states. So great a proportion of Blacks as to hazard the tranquility and happiness of the free citizens. Indeed, plans and conspiracies have already been concerted by them more than once, unquote. Granger goes on to caution against, quote, everything which tends to increase their knowledge of natural rights, unquote. And finally, this last passage points to the use of African Americans, presumably mostly slaves, already carrying the mail then. He says, the most active and intelligent are employed as post riders. They are the most ready to learn and the most able to execute. By traveling day to day and hourly mixing with people, they will acquire information. They will learn that a man's rights do not depend on his color. They will in time become teachers to their brethren. The Post Office Committee quickly complied by moving Granger's proposed bill forward. It was voted by the House, by the Senate, signed that same year by President Thomas Jefferson as the Public Law and Post Roads Statute. And the law proclaimed that, quote, no other than a free white person shall be employed in carrying the mail of the United States, unquote, making whites who violated that law subject to a $50 fine. And that law was revised, strengthened in 1810 and again in 1825. In retrospect, these white-only postal statutes might be considered among the first federal labor laws passed by Congress. Interestingly, despite America's denial of equal rights to women across the board at that time, these particular laws made no gender restrictions to mail delivery or mail conveyance, although postal officials were never shy about their opposition to female appointments. By 1852, women made up less than 1% of all postmaster appointments. They didn't serve as clerks until after the Civil War era. So for Granger, work at the post office for Blacks could be fatal to white democracy. It was a conspiracy theory of a likely conspiracy. Black people would see the status position as an indicator that they had equal rights to whites, take advantage of this network to conspire to rebel. Black democracy, in other words, as seen in the Haitian slave revolt, would arrive at our shores through the post office. Meanwhile, the political party that in 1828 adopted the name Democratic promoted slaveholding as well as the spoils system, evoking this zero-sum wartime imagery to the victor go the spoils, and took the practice of political patronage to a higher level. So while the post office was a federal agency, in fact, it was America's largest throughout the 19th century, it nevertheless acquiesced to Southern suppression of abolitionist literature. Mark Cheatham reminded us recently that President Andrew Jackson in 1835 responded affirmatively to his fellow slaveholder Amos Kendall, who also happened to be his postmaster general, that abolitionist literature currently flooding the mails into the South constituted a threat of quote unquote servile war. Jackson approved Kendall's suppression of that literature unless subscribers requested it. And President Jackson later that year asked Congress for legislation outlawing such, quote, inflammatory appeals addressed to the passions of the slaves, unquote, but he was rebuffed. The Postmaster General position itself was an appointed one, with only 2 postmasters in the whole history of the U.S. Post Office Department from 1775 to July 1, 1971, having had any prior postal experience. That would be Ben Franklin and Ebenezer Hazard, both in the Continental Congress era. Post Office itself was organized in rigid hierarchical terms that were anything but democratic. It was, in fact, the union organizing at the Post Office after the Civil War that introduced a democratic counterbalance coming from its workforce. So the fraught first decades of labor organizing at the Post Office highlighted the anti-democratic internal structure of the Post Office, upheld not only by its Postmaster General, but Congress and the President as well. So you'd look at the Gag Orders, right, of the early 20th century against postal worker complaints to Congress, the Gag Orders by Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. So that, in other words, the same post office that's expanding services that enable democracy, like more post offices, rural free delivery in 1906, cheap postage, parcel post as an antidote to private carriers gouging customers, postal banking as an antidote to the absence of adequate banking. The post office was still willing to battle with workers, especially Black workers. There's a quote that I'm sure everybody has seen, but from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, written in 1831, the quote is, he's making his way through Michigan by stagecoach, but I want to cite it anyway. He says, "I traveled along a portion of the frontier of the United States in a sort of cart, which was termed the mail, along roads which were scarcely marked out through the immense forests. From time to time, we came to a hut in the midst of the forest. This was a post office. The mail dropped an enormous bundle of letters at this isolated dwelling, and we pursued our way at full gallop, leaving the inhabitants of the neighboring log houses to send for their share of the treasure." So de Tocqueville's quote is evocative. It highlights the speed, exuberance, and collective drive to move the mail to distant corners of the Republic, and of course across Native American lands. 3 decades later, Republican Party patronage, beginning in 1865 with new legislation, replaces the antebellum all-white post office and enables the first Black postal employment, especially in Washington, D.C. and the South. It continues after the 1883 Civil Service Act, with African Americans scoring high on exams and making that job a niche, a job migration magnet or a niche job for African Americans. By 1913, with Black postal workers now about 10% of the postal workforce, President Woodrow Wilson's Postmaster General appointee, Albert Burleson, convinced him to segregate the civil service, exclude Black applicants, requiring photos, purge Black employees, cut benefits to all postal employees. This is the same Postmaster General who also promoted parcel post, postal banking, airmail, and even postalization of the telephone and telegraph. But after Wilson and Burleson were gone, African Americans resumed accelerating their migration into the post office and its unions. They also created their own networks, including a Black union that many were simultaneously members of, along with craft unions. The post office became a middle-class job that provided home ownership opportunities, college education for postal workers and their children. As many pursued college while working at the post office or pursued their professions after they had gone to college. Job security for activism and leading citizenship roles in the Black community. By 1960, African Americans made up 20% of the post office and majorities or near majorities in a dozen of America's largest cities. By 1940, 28% of postal workers had college degrees. By 2000, Black postal workers were in the top 25% of Black earners and above the national mean. From World War II to 2000, African Americans were at least twice as likely to work for the post office as whites. And I say at least because it could be 6 or 7 times higher in many major cities like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, New Orleans, Atlanta, Memphis, Houston. Okay, so I want to talk about the postal strike before I conclude. And so the 1970 postal strike involved between 1/4 and 1/3 of the highly unionized postal workforce, which was 87.5% in 1968. That was as democratic an exercise as you could find in labor history. And it was the inspiration for my most recent book. The strike's national leadership, for all practical purposes, was the New York City postal workers. Were roughly made up of whom roughly 40% were African American, rather than a handful of charismatic individuals. And it was both planned and spontaneous. So even though the NALC President James Rademacher and AFL-CIO President George Meany both claimed credit later for the strike's accomplishments based on their negotiating skills, it was the strikers who did it. So crystallized in that strike was the contradiction, though, of government service versus business operation. There was already highlighted in the 1968 Capital Commission report that called for a government postal corporation as part of long-needed postal reforms. So the Postal Service really was Nixon's 1970 compromise with the postal unions and liberal Democrats. Nixon and his Postmaster General Winton Blount had played hardball throughout 1969 and 1970, trying to advance the agenda of the Capital Commission, demanding a postal corporation in exchange for the raises, any kind of raises for postal workers, and full collective bargaining rights, which they agreed should be in any new postal corporation. So the 8-day strike from March 18th to 25th, 1970 forced the issue. There was an impasse in Congress. It forced negotiations because of the threat of more strikes. Postal workers were still and are still denied the right to strike, but they also won the rights to contract arbitration, a no layoff clause after 6 years, and an ability to negotiate over technology. So now with this walkout of 28% of the postal workforce, it was obvious that postal reform legislation had to be rebooted. Postal workers won a 14% raise. They won better terms in this government/business hybrid that ironically was more democratic than the US Post Office Department, but then the Post Office Department set an extremely low bar. In conclusion, and I know I've skipped a lot, but we can cover that in the question and answer session. So as President Trump has taken steps to undermine and even dismantle American democracy, Postmaster General DeJoy, who is a Trump mega donor and not appointed by Trump, but rather by the predominantly Trump appointed Board of Governors, US Postal Service Board of Governors. From his first day in office, DeJoy has been engaged in literally dismantling the Postal Service and flouting Title 39 of the US Code, also known as the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970, which became amended by the 2006 Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. There had already been a slowdown in the hiring at the craft level before DeJoy froze management hiring in July 2020, and the secure government job that many communities, especially African Americans, have relied on for generations is endangered, as is the service that has grown over the years. The post office is a kind of canary in the coal mine of democracy itself in the United States. Trump's privatization plan, the Postal Service that he first rolled out in June of 2018, could not even rouse sufficient Republican support when it arrived in Congress. So effectively, DeJoy's delays were at the service of Trump's animus towards mail-in ballots in what Judge Stanley Bastian of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Washington on September 17, 2020 called voter disenfranchisement, part of that's a direct quote, part of, quote, an intentional effort on the part of the current administration to disrupt and challenge the legitimacy of upcoming local, state, and federal elections. So combined with Trump's animus towards the Postal Service for its negotiated service agreement with Amazon that has been successful in bringing revenue into the Postal Service, but because its CEO is Jeff Bezos, there's a personal beef there. Trump has also advanced the privatization agenda that never could get any traction in the 80s and 90s, but in the 2000s, there was a neoliberal assumption that saw the Postal Service that became a self-fulfilling prophecy as a service that needed to be even more commercialized or privatized, and so all of that, in combination. But today, with a 91% approval rating, even before the DeJoy policy changes, the idea of the post office remains as popular as ever. And for the first time that I've ever seen, a September 28th poll has Americans favoring the Postal Service being run as a service over a business by more than a 2-to-1 margin. So despite critics' claims that a non-transactional post office is something hopelessly archaic, Americans like it. They depend on it and would probably enjoy more uses made of it. The African-American struggle for equality at the post office helped open doors to make it one of the most diverse workplaces in the country, according to the Pew Research Center in 2020. The Postal Service, while the workforce itself has shrunk, the percentage is still the same. Roughly, it's 23% African American, 11% Hispanic, 7% Asian, and 45% female. In what I call the spirit of 1970 in my book Undelivered, there is evidence of postal workers not just depending on their unions now to file grievances, lobby Congress, and form coalitions with postal consumers, but also resisting DeJoy's cutbacks on the job. So I just want to quote from Judge Vincent Marrero in his Jones v. USPS from September 21st, 2020, one of 7 injunctions. Some of the other orders order DeJoy to stop mothballing collection boxes and dismantling mail sorting machines. A recent order even orders him to restore them. But the other policies, for instance, banning overtime, banning late and extra trips from mail processing centers, to the point where you sometimes have trucks pulling away without mail heading out to the stations. And in addition to not treating all ballots as first-class mail. Here's what Marrero says: nothing is more essential to a true democracy than the right to vote. Where that right is constitutionally guaranteed and exercised by citizens through free and fair elections protected by government authority, democratic rule thrives. Conversely, impairing the franchise or imposing undue burdens on the ability of voters to cast ballots for their elected leaders necessarily threatens democracy and erodes the underpinnings of a Republican form of government. One of the evident ways by which our society fosters and guarantees voting rights is by absentee balloting, accommodating the exceptional needs of citizens unable to vote in person for various legitimate reasons, unquote. The idea of the post office has changed as the idea of democracy itself has evolved in America. Postal changes often have come by popular demand, whether it was lowering postage rates on newspapers and then postal correspondence after that, or creating universal free city delivery during the Civil War, or rural free delivery and providing inexpensive parcel post and postal banking, all of those being People's Party or populist demands in the late 19th century. Historically, there's been a kind of call and response process between the people and the post office, ironically known for its repressive workplace atmosphere. Labor rights of the post office themselves increased with the rise of unions and later with the nationwide 1970 Postal Wildcat Strike, which itself transformed the unions into more democratic entities, organizations. The Postal Service is not a socialist institution. Not that there would be anything wrong with that, but to conservatives still fighting the New Deal or the Great Society, it might as well be, along with any other government service whose purpose is non-transactional, but rather service. Finally, it's not a coincidence that the revanchist idea of white nationalism and white supremacy, and a revised version of neoliberalism synthesized in Trump's 2016 campaign and then presidency correlates with the anti-democratic idea of abolishing the public post office and handing over its services to UPS, FedEx, Walmart, and presumably Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner. The idea of democracy, on the other hand, is embedded in everyday people's collective historical idea of the post office. Democracy lives or dies based on its institutions, its popular ideas, and the movements that generations of people built and fought over, and that future generations must be willing to defend. This idea of the post office is not over.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We already have a couple of questions coming in. Please use the Q&A function and I will curate those, and we'll get to them kind of in and amongst our chat. I want to start off, I have a kind of a general question about the present. I love the way you talk about the post office and democracy as being in a kind of symbiotic relationship and a dynamic relationship that has changed over time. And there's so many ways to think about the Postal Service as a democratic institution. You mentioned the founding documents really positioned the Postal Service as the lifeblood of democracy in being central to kind of information flows that were newspapers at the time, but information flows that are at the center of democratic practice. But then over the years, more and more layers accrue. So it becomes a really important labor institution, a really important center of union activity and of African-American employment. It becomes both a fact and a symbol of good governance. It becomes a kind of iconic institution of our public sphere. And it becomes a central institution to our voting process, as Judge Marrero said. Can you talk about all those different dimensions? Where should our attention be fixed right now when we think about the relationship between the Postal Service and democracy? I know everyone is, I mean, the voting is the thing that's bound to fix your attention in this month. But I think that the issues are much broader, and I'd just love to hear you reflect a little bit on some of the broader relationships right now in 2020 between the Postal Service and democracy.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was looking around, can't put my fingers on it, but Steve Hutkins and Mark Jameson from SaveThePostOffice.com have this wonderful piece that they just posted last week towards a postal reform agenda, and it just lays out what the kind of things that could that take us from a place where we are, or many of us are, or feel like today, where we feel like we need to defend the post office, and we're horrified at what's happening to the post office. But it needs to go beyond that. There needs to be a fix. So, a fix to the problem that were left by the Postal Reorganization Act that made it half, government agency and half business. So, even before the pandemic, postal voting, postal balloting was gaining in popularity. People wouldn't have to take off work. 5 states were using it full time. The pandemic, I think, has accelerated that. So, I mean, it's a crucial issue now, what happens when the pandemic passes. I think there will still be a role for that, but it also highlights the importance of the Postal Service as a civic institution, as a government institution, as a service, okay? It's what unites us. It's like, one of the thing that upset so many people when they found their mail going from, well, we've seen the figures now, from 93% on time to down to 85 to down 70%. First class mail. It's like, wait, that's my stuff. Wait, other people have stuff too. And the Postal Service is something that connects us, and suddenly it's not accountable. How did that happen? The Postmaster General can be called because there is congressional oversight, but he doesn't have to tell the truth. He doesn't have to, so there have to be I mean, the congressional oversight didn't impose anything on him. There had to be injunctions but what recourse is there? So, this brings up the other issue is I was just glancing at the Q&A. Somebody was talking about postal banking. The other functions that could be revived or invented as functions for the postal service, which we typically think of just being letter carriers, but of course there's over-the-road drivers, there are clerks, there are mail handlers, people who work in post offices and in mail sorting facilities that could be updated since the amount of mail is changing and the types of mail are changing. Okay, now there's the post office. You notice I use those terms interchangeably. The post office, the postal service, it can continue to be a post office. It can grow into the 21st century, and so it does not just have to be, in terms of once a year or twice a year delivering ballots, but it's an essential connection for democracy, as hubs for Wi-Fi, for instance.
Right. Here's a question. Can you say more about African Americans finding employment in the post office in the 19th century? In what ways was it different to be employed as a mailman, or let's just say in the mail service in general, compared to other working class jobs?
It's a great question. So a lot of jobs were not available in the private sector to African Americans because of outright prejudice from white employers, white employees, or both. And it was not that the Postal Service or the post office was standing there with open arms. I think it was, in my research for my book, There's Always Work at the Post Office, they found an entry into it. They, in many ways, forced their way in. As soon as that legislation was passed that enabled them to work at the post office, they took advantage of patronage jobs, ironically through the Republican Party at the time. That was a party of equality. And in the South, it was more likely that they would be letter carriers. Over time, I did a lot of oral histories. African American postal workers would talk about how there was like a gentleman's agreement. They would let them be letter carriers, whites, that is, white postal workers let them be letter carriers, but not clerks. But that might also vary with, town to town or state to state. But they made it a niche job, okay, through patronage, through the craft positions, through the postmasters, and it could be, some of the first Black postal workers were abolitionists, were Union Army veterans, and they were also union members. They also helped found some of the unions. So this was, this became the niche for them, to be employed at increasingly higher rates than their percentage of the population.
I want to come back to the banking question in just a second, but is there a little bit later, like in the early 20th century, I know that Pullman porters played a really important role in delivering newspapers. I mean, the famous one is the Chicago Defender, but the people working on the rails, and especially African American men, played a really significant role in getting news out. After that kind of collapses as an alternative for Black employment, do some of those people end up in the postal service? Is there much traffic between the Brotherhood of Pullman car workers and postal workers?
Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Yeah, I never thought of that. I never thought of that connection because there was already a railway mail service. That started in 1864. The actual birth of the historically Black postal union, known as the National Alliance of Postal Employees, which is still extant as a federal workers union now, began in 1913 after Black railway mail clerks were excluded from the white railway clerks union. No, so I'm not aware of any kind of connection, but but there's that kind of mobility is similar, for railway mail clerks to be able to, sorting the mail, as the trains go throughout the South, and distributing, black newspapers like the Chicago Defender. So not that different from black mariners in the
Right.
18, late 19th and late 18th and into the 19th century, smuggling abolitionist tracts in their clothing when the with the gag orders from Congress in 1835 that was tired of all these petitions for petitions against slavery.
Great. Here's another question. I'm still going to come back to the banking question, but this one first.
Don't forget banking.
Can you discuss, because I have a question I want to append to that. Can you discuss the USPS and its place in today's increasingly competitive delivery market?
That's a really good question. I mean, that's the question, right? It's like, what should be the role of the Postal Service when there are alternatives? And my answer is that I try to look at it from the point of view, not of the Postal Service as a business, which I think Trump and DeJoy have reduced the Postal Service to, is just, like I said, a hub of FedEx and UPS. I mean, speaking of symbiosis, I mean, there's that, and as well as competition. The Postal Service uses FedEx planes. FedEx and UPS make use of the Postal Service's last mile delivery. Each one of those private carriers carries something like 5.5 billion pieces of mail products, mostly parcels, but mail products per year. But the Postal Service is 142 billion. Okay, so if the Postal Service just becomes a hub or an auxiliary, then it's not really doing its job as a service. So what do we do though with the influence? Because that's really what it comes down to. If the Postal Service has to compete as a business, then it loses sight of its service. How do I want to put this? I don't think the influence of UPS or FedEx could be any stronger than it is today. I mean, in 2006, they had a multi-million-dollar lobbying campaign that enabled really severe constraints to be put on postal competitiveness. I think that needs to change in going forward. I mean, we can do that, just as in the 1840s and 50s, Congress did in order to enable the post office to provide a better service network and service link, did impose limits on on private carriers. The same thing happened in the early 20th century when private carriers were gouging the public. They enabled the institution of parcel post. So I think that's something we're going to have to. That's a choice we're going to have to fight for and fight over.
Right. In this context of privatization and the push to reestablish the Postal Service on a total business model, the neoliberal project you were talking about, I've heard it said, and it sounds reasonable, but I'm highly skeptical. Could it be that Americans could just buy if everyone bought a book of stamps and threw it away, we could save the Postal Service?
That was an interesting part of the campaign when people were becoming upset about that the Postal Service might go under. Okay, when Postmaster General Brennan, before the end of her term in mid-June of 2020, was predicting the Postal Service might run out of cash, might run out of operating cash by September. And people were, suddenly, how did this happen? They didn't realize that, how much the Postal Accountability Enhancement Act had handcuffed it. But no, I mean, just buying stamps, just I mean, just adding that much more revenue.
It's not enough.
I mean, I haven't, it's funny, I have not done the math or seen anyone do the math, but that's not the problem. There is so much crushing, there is so much imposed debt,
Right.
from the Retiree Health Benefits Fund that actually Congress does have it within their hands. I mean, the House passed a bill that it's still waiting for the Senate to pass that would forgive the rest of the retiree health benefits debt that was imposed on it. There's already $47 billion in the Retiree Health Benefits Fund. They used to use pay-as-you-go. So this is, but when you hear inflated figures like $160 billion in unfunded liabilities, that would be like me saying, well, I heard you've got a $160,000 mortgage. I'm going to write in the newspaper that you've got $160,000 worth of unfunded liabilities. Why can't you pay it off? Well, that's not how the mortgage is supposed to work.
Yeah. We're
So
down.
I still buy I buy my stamps by mail and mail. I just got informed delivery, which now reminds me what the Postal Service missed when it didn't jump on the email bandwagon. And I think it's also been prevented from developing that. But I still think that there should be that there could be an email address connected to a
Right.
to a physical address. I think that would take care of a lot of problems with security.
Yeah, we have a question actually on exactly that. Do you see the role of the Postal Service changing alongside the increasingly digital forms of meaning gathering, i.e. the transfer of import from information to data, which is kind of what you're addressing here? How you kind of talked about the road not taken by the Postal Service, but is it too late?
I don't see why, but I mean, I don't work in public policy. I'm a scholar, and I like to suggest things. And the idea has been proposed of getting the Postal Service involved in email, not just looking at informed delivery, so you can see what your mail is. I still think that there's room for that as a way of connecting Americans more rather than connecting us less. And I would add to that, trying to, with just 3 or 4 minutes left, we've been talking about the United States as if, like we're this lonely island in the world, when we're part of a global postal system, and the United States Postal Service handles half the world's mail.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be a positive connection there, and it's a very good question. I hope I didn't sound to the questioner like I was dodging it, but adding digital connections worldwide, not just nationwide, I think is an excellent idea.
Yeah. Well, in our last couple of minutes, I just want to take us back to where you started us, because it was so tragically appropriate, thinking about the election 1 week out. And when you think about the last 20 years of the Postal Service, there's the kind of assault that was led by Congress during the George W. Bush years. And then there's DeJoy and what he's done in dismantling and slowing down the postal delivery. Those two moments seem to me to represent two different anti-democratic projects. One is the kind of capitalist project of neoliberalism, kind of privatize everything, put everything on the business model, get rid of the public sector altogether. The other one is a more recent Republican Party project of gearing up for minoritarian rule. Am I right in seeing these as distinct, or do you see them as one big kind of tendency in American political life and anti-democratic politics in the last generation or so? How do you look at that?
There's definitely a connection, and Republicans definitely did take the lead in the PAEA, but there was Democratic support such that in 2006, it passed on a voice vote. So a lot of Congress people look back at embarrassment, like some of them even say we were suckered, we didn't know what we were voting on. What gets worse, though, when I look back, is that Congress, once it saw its mistake, didn't see any need to fix it. In fact, there was a tendency by both parties to look at the Postal Service as an annoyance, and it made it easy. Well, it wasn't until the Democrats, the Democratic Party captured the House starting in 2019 that you start to see a resurgence of interest in pushing back against this, what you call this anti-democratic idea of the post office, of privatizing it. And it seems to me to be like responding to, wait, what have we done? Wait, what are some possibilities here? So they were listening, I think, to postal unions and postal consumers, who wanted more, who wanted a reversal. And then the pandemic, I think, became postal manufactured crisis, 2.0. Not that the coronavirus is manufactured, but that the fact that that you could not get one whole House of Congress and the president to agree to emergency funding for the Postal Service to keep it afloat. Even though it had been keeping itself going, since in total since 1983. So I think that made people start to ask, like, wait, if this is a valuable service, why are we even debating whether or not to save it? Why are we talking about starving it? So I think there's been a change.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I feel like I've learned a lot, and the Postal Service is an institution that we probably just don't think about enough, and it's probably time we start. Thanks everybody for coming. Vote, 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 vote safely. Wash your hands, don't touch your face, be safe. It's great to have you here, and we will see you all on November 17th at our next event, if we still have a country.
Oh, Lord. Thank you so much, Dr. Rubio. We appreciate it.
I'm optimistic.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Phil.
Everybody have a good night.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks.